Black lights and booze burn when I record for Watts. And every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything, everything black. Culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor Christopher Freeburg, Professor of English at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's the author of Melville and the Idea of Blackness, Race and Imperialism in the 19th Century America, published by Cambridge University Press in 2012. Black Aesthetics and the Interior Life, published by the University of Virginia Press in 2017. And he joins us today to talk about his most recent book, Counterlife, Slavery After Resistance and Social Death, which is published by Duke University Press. Of Counterlife, our friend Margot Natalie Crawford writes, Christopher Freeburg's theory of counterlife is the refreshing new grammar that breaks out of slavery, studies conscious and unconscious lapses into the binary of social death or social life. Counterlife adds crucial new dimensions to the study of the artistic representation of enslaved Africans. This bold, brilliant study teaches us how to stumble with uncertainty and vulnerability into the ever-expanding archive of slavery. How are you doing today, Christopher?
I'm doing great. I think Margot said it all, so I'm ready to go home.
Talk a little bit about how you get to Counterlife. What were some of the influences and inspirations for writing this book? Which is a real challenge, to how we think about slavery studies at this point.
I think there are a lot of different strands. But I think a lot of different strands of thought, of Black thought, of different writers. But I think mostly the concept was I found the relationship between the art that I was reading in my own life, which was I couldn't figure stuff out all the time, and I couldn't put it. And I often was grasping for the right phrases or rubrics to make sense of my own world. And I found that the art, the fiction, the music that I was listening to, I felt had so many different dimensions of it. And I was like, one of the most constricting places for us in terms of, and there are a lot of different reasons why, I think, is the 19th century and the subject of slavery, trying to make sense of the cruelty, the trauma, the transformational power of Black folks in their everyday lives. And I just felt like that was where I kind of where my journey started. Where the kind of the insight that brought about my journey started.
Yeah, you say something really striking in the intro. This idea of approaching slave texts without insisting on their political utility, right? And there's a way in which I think, when we think about texts that refer to slavery, both in the period and after, our discomfort with the humor of slavery, for instance, right? When Dave Chappelle does skits about, that we don't quite know what to do with it, because we always seem to think of those slavery texts, particularly historians in some contexts, for how much value they are politically to inform the moment that we're in now, right?
Yes.
As you mentioned very early in the book, right? You have this elusive term like freedom, and the antithesis of freedom is always slavery, right? And we don't allow slavery the same kind of nuance that we often have to allow freedom, right? Because it's something that is so elusive.
Yeah, I really tried to. I think one of the first things I had to get honest with about, and I try to allude to this in the introduction, was this concept of listening differently to the slavery archive. And I mentioned people like David Scott, like Tina Camp, and other people who actually talk about the character Phoebe from The Rise of Watching God as a way of trying to be a deeper and better listener in ways that make me uncomfortable. I guess one of the ways I was thinking about earlier today was I often think that I often have the urge to put my point of view onto the text and to change the text or the song to route it in a way that makes sense to me. And I wanted to give more of the text to have more of an impact on me, to change me and expand and stretch me in different ways. And so I felt like doing that would mean getting out of my comfort zone, and which because my comfort zone, where I put the field at in the book, is where I'm at. so yeah.
Talk a little bit about your concept of counterlife. It's a word that you pull from the work of Philip Roth, but you're using it in very different kind of ways. What for you is counterlife?
Yeah, counterlife for me, I think it's kind of a negative term in the sense that it doesn't. I use it as a way of almost like an anything but. So I'm thinking about when scholars of slavery wrote about trying to show the courage and heroism of trying to show and still trying to show important ways the heroism and the courage of slaves, or people or scholars trying to write about the journey to agency, or lapses into of what we call oppositional consciousness, or an overwhelming senses of a life of social death. And I took my idea of counterlife was how do I think about the different selves and relationships that don't fit into those categories or exceed them, And I think one of the examples I had was actually this didn't actually end up in the book, was when Frederick Douglass has the literacy school in the narrative of the life. He has this literacy school, and he's teaching all these other slaves how to read, and he talks really intensely about the love and friendship that they shared, and ultimately literacy, which is very important in the book as his gateway into thinking about freedom. There's a moment to think about interpersonal connection and the moral power of interpersonal connection. That doesn't mean that it doesn't end up talking about freedom again. It does, but there's still some really important ways that he's talking about intimacy between men in a book. So I think there's a lot to be said just in and of itself.
Yeah, I mean, I like that idea of, how to capture this moment that can't quite be captured in the ways that we've often captured it. It makes it distinct. Counterlife then becomes distinct then from the conversation that we've been having about the afterlives of slavery, right? Where we're looking for that formation that we know so well and how it gets recuperated, in all kinds of ways in the contemporary moment. You're really asking for something else. I want to read this, quote of yours from the book. The counterlife of slavery then is my call to be vulnerable to what is undoubtedly enigmatic and irreducible enslaved texts, to bear witness to the force of slavery's artistic representations without measuring their importance on scales of political efficacy. If you could unpack that a little bit more.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to. I try to move from in the book from things that are like slave narrative or actual versions of history. I move to talk about visual art of like Radcliffe Bailey, right, or the fiction of Edward Jones. And when I think about some of like the visual art of someone like Radcliffe Bailey, he, slavery and his like notes on Almina paintings is, it's of the, it's on the West African coast, the portals where slaves were transferred onto ships. And so there is this strong, compelling historical traumatic element to, but at the same time, he's interlacing different colors that are bright, or musical notes, classical musical notes, but also the multiplicity in repetition that he uses in improvisation that he's trying to inspire is also jazzy. So he's doing this thing where it's rooted in a historical moment that's certainly traumatic and real for us, but at the same time, he's playing around with it in such a way that it becomes an experience. It's actually disorienting for the person experiencing the art. So I think those are some of the things that I try to capture when I mean by being vulnerable and open to the enigmatic possibilities of slavery in art.
Yeah, when you talk in that chapter about, Douglass and Edward P. Jones and Bailey, this idea that for these very different kind of reporters, for lack of a better way to describe it, slavery serves as a vessel for eternity, event, stasis, and movement, right? It's so much more than simply being this moment of trauma. that we've
Mm-hmm.
continued to extrapolate, from, for centuries now to some
Mm-hmm.
extent.
Mm-hmm.
What else drew you to the work of Bailey? Because normally we wouldn't think about Radcliffe Bailey as part of a conversation the way, I mean, with Douglas and even Edward P. Jones, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's on the nose,
Right,
right? We talk
right.
about its connections to Black enslavement. Why did Bailey resonate for you in such a way?
I think it's his. I mean, he has several. I think it's relation. One of the things is his relationship to history, or how he thinks about history, and I always find that like I said, he always begins, or not always, he often begins with some type of historical concrete origin point. Maybe his family in South Carolina, but then he thinks about that DNA lineage back to West Africa, and he thinks about his own travels with those memories where they go. So for me, and then he always is incorporating this kind of almost soundtrack, soundtrack of usually a kind of a jazz soundtrack, and he puts that literally in his installations. And I just found that I found it overwhelming in its profundity, but I also found it challenging to give a rubric to it. In other words, but at the same time, it was being historical. It is about slavery and memory and history at the same time. It's shattering all these ways that I think about it. So I think that's what I guess what I'm trying to say is it was almost my inability to characterize him that drew me to him for this project.
Of course, I was drawn to the chapter "Sounds of Blackness," where you talk about spirituals, the performance of them, our recollections of them, and you raise this question, right? When enslaved Africans sang spirituals, what were they saying? What did it mean? Why is it important? And you delve into this body of scholarship, that's rather pronounced. Folks trying to argue that the utility of actual spirituals, to help Black folks get through the day, could even make an argument that, historical uses of harmony and rhythm, that these songs were the laboratory for that, right? And also, particularly in the post-1970s, the idea that these spirituals were used as almost social media, right? As coded messages, right? And all of it is legit, right, for us to talk about and discuss. But you kind of push it beyond that, right? You really go and put back to that notion of Douglas and these interpersonal relationships. What did those songs mean in that moment for those people who were grouped in that space? So talk a little bit about how you discuss spirituals in this chapter.
I think I was watching a sermon from one of my mentors, and he was Father Joseph Brown. He's a director of Black Studies at Carbondale, and he's a priest, and he was talking to a group of people on Martin Luther King's weekend, and he was talking about the idea of the song "Wade in the Water." And he was talking about he gave an elaborate description of he brought out the kind of the life in the song, and he brought up the idea of ancestors or elders calling the youth or someone who is looking for a transformation in their life, calling them into the water. And in my head I was like, but so what do they call them in the water for? What are they thinking? And what is the person thinking? And how many times, I just started thinking about a whole lot of questions. And I was just like, the funny is that everybody there may have this, everybody in that moment has this idea of like what the goal may be, which is spiritual transformation, a different outlook on life, a new set of experiences, all set to the rhythm in the song. Yet at the same time, what that person's actually dealing with, some people may know a little bit, but it's always partial, it's always incomplete. And I was saying, but at the same time, you may feel it fully and feel it in a transformational way. And so that's what I was thinking about, that with all of the history and the music of the moans and the songs and the solos and the riffing and the relationship between the groups and the singers, that that there's so much going on in our minds, so much power there, so many different stories that it's impossible to kind of track, yet they're still there in a prevalent and powerful way.
Yeah. And you mentioned, right, the difficulties of recording, stabilizing, and trying to make these moans, if you will, into an intellectual object when
Right.
they're actively resisting being recorded, being captured, right? There's almost a kind of maroon quality, to these moans, right? That at least for us as scholars, creates a real challenge to how we deal with that particular archive, right? And again, this is stuff that predates, at least in terms of the slavery songs, it predates recording, right?
That's right.
In a technological sense that we think of it. You end that chapter talking about Aretha Franklin and performances of, in particular, Precious Lord, which she does at the White House.
I love the Lord. He heard my cry.
She's there with the Williams brothers, and they're like, we're about to have church, and they have church.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
But when she gets to the power of that moan, you raise the question, what are people hearing? What is she moaning about in that particular moment? What drew you to Aretha Franklin in this particular performance?
I think just watching it a few times and being just blown away by it. I don't, in other words, I think I'd probably say listening to the stories that she was telling in between the songs about how she got the things that, many people make, I feel like I listen to very popular artists. They're so popular and so have such a great standing with us that I feel like I know a lot about them and I actually don't. And so they start telling, these stories about I remember she talking about her father and how she got in this song and the advice that her family used to give her, and just and she's kind of mumbling this stuff, not mumbling it, but saying it kind of not in a very sermonic way. And it just got me wondering, got me thinking a lot about whenever I actually gave this talk, I ended up in tears because I started thinking about my grandmother and the story and advice that she would tell me, and her kind of moaning and humming around the house and stuff like that. So I think that's part of. I think it was not just the performance itself, but it was what she was articulating in between and around the songs. That kind of that informal, familial memories that she seemed to be very powerfully feeling at the moment. I think that's what really drew me to it.
You write about the Boondocks in the book, and Catcher Freeman.
Catcher Freeman was the greatest black man who ever lived. He was Malcolm X, Nat Turner, and Barack Obama all rolled into one.
What drew you to the Boondocks, which in some ways, strikes me as beyond the field of popular culture studies, has probably been underutilized, for the ways that it offers comment on history and ask us to reconsider, what we think about history. So what drew you to the Boondocks, and particularly this episode with Catcher Freeman?
Yeah, well, I think one of the main things that drew me to it was the listening. First of all, when Grandpa Freeman is talking to Huey and Riley about their family stories, and this and everybody, like you say, everybody's related to us.
The story of Catcher Freeman.
Come on, Granddad. I know nothing about history, but I ain't stupid. None of that story is true.
It is true. Catcher Freeman was a hero, and don't you ever forget it. Excuse me.
It just reminded me a lot of my mom telling me we had an uncle so and so who did this, who started this, was the first black electrician, and I just remembered, and so it was fun, but at the same time it was. So I feel like it captured the idea of the need for a story, the significance of family storytelling, but at the same time, that the youth were smart enough to be skeptical of it, in the sense that, okay, we may even like these stories, but are they true? How do we find the truth anyway? So you have these important things about Black family storytelling or kinds of modes of history and memory, but the question about, well, who's got the right story and is it true? So I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, you talk about counter history as an aesthetic genre that is committed more to storytelling and history, right? And you raise this question, right? Is all Black history counter history?
Yeah.
Where do you fall down on that?
I think it can. I think it can be. I mean, I guess partly what I was trying to say is that as we begin to, depending on who the audience is, as we begin to tell stories and more or less accept these stories, then it becomes more part of what we teach, what we introduce, what we disseminate as knowledge. And the question is it still counter history? And I guess ultimately that question could be, it depends who you're talking to. Like, like talking to some people about slavery nowadays is information that could be banished or could be excluded from curriculums. So in that context, just the discussion about slavery or discussion about critical race theory becomes its own kind of counter history. But in some, maybe in our academic context, most of us have accepted certain modes of teaching about slavery and Black life in America. It may not be. It may be just part of the more of an official record that we have, that we produce knowledge about and give interviews about. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, to answer the question is, it depends.
Let me go in a different direction for a little bit, Christopher. Your first book is on Melville and the idea of Blackness. Mm-hmm. Have you at all been surprised or shocked by this particular moment? Because part of the work that you're doing there really is to excavate conversations about race and Blackness in places where we're not expected to have those conversations, right? And if we think about 1619 and all this other kind of stuff that's going on now, as that writ large, trying to put race at the center of these discussions that we haven't had before, have you at all been surprised at the kind of fervor that has become attached to any conversations about race in the archive or Blackness, particularly in the American archive?
I would say I'd probably say I'm not surprised. I mean, I want to be surprised. Like, you want to be like, oh my God, what's the problem? But when I was an undergrad, what my mentors told me that, if you want to study African-American literature, a lot of these Black writers that you admire read Melville, Hawthorne, James. They read these figures and they read them very closely. And I was like, oh, I got to read them. I was like, this book is long, and it's not about me. And so, I mean, I feel like the kind of political fervor and conflict around these questions where we're moving back to not moving back, but going to these people like Melville or Emerson or other figures who, for most of America, is not associated with racial difference at all. Right, and we're putting race at the center of these conversations. I think people are always thrown off by when you mess around with their models, or you mess around with their comfort levels. And so that was partly in a broader way, what I was trying to do with that. So yeah, it doesn't surprise me, unfortunately.
You mentioned Douglas and the literacy group that he formed. Were there other stories that you weren't able to address that you wanted to address in the book?
I mean, I guess I'm thinking about, even though I did address it shortly, I really wanted to talk more about Their Eyes Were Watching God. Yeah. I ended up getting cut from the book, but I just found, and so when I say I found, this is something that Black feminists have been talking about for a long time. I found, they've been founded, but I rediscovered just the relationship between the grandmother and Janie, Nana and Janie, and the idea of sexual abuse, rape, and trauma, and that is such a key part. I'd probably say the thing that I felt with hasn't been dealt with enough in that book is as how Scenes of Subjection that book is. People talk about that book as a romantic book, and I feel like when I read this book, when I see what happened to Janie's mother, and I guess my point was in terms of my Counterlife book was I was so surprised at what's about how enigmatic that problem of history becomes in the book, and how it ends up, with her having to shoot, her love interest to kill her, to save herself, tea cake. And I just feel like in terms of the step back conversation about this book being so romantic, I'm just like, this could be a rough book. And
almost Afro pessimist.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah, absolutely. So that was something that I wanted to get into more in the book that I didn't get to address more. And I kind of had to make my points and move on, as my editor said.
What's next for you, Christopher?
I'm working on a book. On Black cultural, on a brief history of Black cultural life. And which is I feel like an equally, if not more, challenging book. It's for a trade book. Okay. And so I'm trying to be more of a storyteller in this book. Yeah. And I'm trying to at the same time to write in an inviting way, but also write with sophistication. I want a book that people, if they want to say, well, hey, how do we tell the story of Black culture? Can we tell the story about Black culture? And if it's possible, how do we do it in a brief history? That's what I'm trying to do. So it's kind of it's a real challenge, but I'm excited to. I'm up to it.
We've been joined today by Professor Christopher Freeburg, Professor of English at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He's the author of Melville and the Idea of Blackness, Race and Imperialism in 19th Century America. That was published by Cambridge in 2012. Black Aesthetics and the Interior Life, published by UVA Press in 2017. And he joined us today to talk about Counterlife, Slavery and Resistance and Social Death, Duke University 2021. Shout out to Courtney Berger. Of Counterlife, Margot Natalie Crawford writes that this bold, brilliant study teaches us how to stumble with uncertainty and vulnerability into the ever-expanding archive of slavery. It's been great talking with you, Chris.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Black lights and booze burn when I